Hi, my name is Olivia Hart, and today I want to tell you a story about the Christmas that changed everything the night I realized how cruel silence can be and how far family can go when love turns into mockery. That night, I walked out into the snow and didn't look back. But what came after the message, the betrayal, the truth about my family's lies was something I never expected. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home, like love only existed when you were useful? I'd really love to know where you're watching this story from. Please leave it in the comments before we begin. Thank you so much. That Christmas, snow was falling thick outside our small house in the suburbs of Portland, the golden lights wrapped around the porch railing glimmering softly in the dark. Neighbors played carols, the sound of bells mingled with the faint scent of waffles and mulled cider in the air. From the outside, the Hart house looked peaceful, like a warm postcard. But inside, the air was heavy and dense enough to feel in every breath. I was carefully setting each plate on the long dining table, aligning the forks and knives perfectly. It was the same every year. They saw me as the one responsible for everything: the dinner, the decorations, the gifts, all of it. Meanwhile, my sister Emily sat cross-legged on the sofa, giggling as she scrolled through her phone. My father, Robert, was glued to the football game, and my mother, Linda, stood by the window, holding her glass of wine, silent, as if afraid that any sound might shatter something fragile in the air. I tried to stay calm, whispering to myself, "Just get through tonight." I used to believe that if I endured long enough, they would finally see me as part of the family, not the housemaid in my own home. While I was adjusting the centerpiece on the table, I heard Emily call out from the living room, "Look at her, still the same as when we were kids. The Hart family's little helper." My father burst out laughing, his beer glass clinking against the wooden table. I pretended not to hear and kept my head down, finishing the setup. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a Facebook notification. Emily had just posted a video, no more than 15 seconds long, filming me folding napkins and placing silverware. The caption read, "Look at this failure. She was always a servant." Right below was my father's red heart reaction and his comment, "Good old Liv, never changes." My mother didn't write anything. She just left a smiling emoji. I stared at the screen, feeling my heart tighten painfully in my chest. I walked into the living room, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "Emily, delete that post. And apologize publicly." My sister looked up, raising an eyebrow with a smug little grin. "Relax, will you? Nobody cares. You are the servant, though." The way she said it, half mocking, half contemptuous, hit like a slap. I stepped closer, my voice trembling but firm. "Delete it. I won't ask again." Emily scoffed, leaning back on the couch. "No one owes you respect, Olivia. You should be used to that by now, shouldn't you?" The room fell silent. I could feel my father's glare cutting through me. Robert stood up, his voice heavy as iron. "That's enough, Olivia. Making a scene again? Your sister was just joking. What's wrong with you? Can't take a joke." I turned to my mother, hoping she'd at least say something fair. But Linda only lowered her head, gently swirling her wine, lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. I gave a faint, bitter smile, feeling a chill crawl up my wrist. Of course. That's what you've always taught them, haven't you? To belittle me, turn me into the family joke, and call it a joke. Robert slammed his hand against the table, the sound sharp enough to make the glasses tremble. "If you can't take it anymore, then get out of my house," he shouted, each word slurred with anger and alcohol. Emily covered her mouth, giggling, as if she had just won a small game. My mother still said nothing. I stood there for a few seconds, heart pounding, the glow of the Christmas lights reflecting in my eyes, a mix of fury, humiliation, and something close to awakening. I looked around the glittering room, the tall, glowing tree, the pile of presents beneath it, the faint smell of cookies, and I realized this place had never been my home. I placed my phone on the table and said quietly, "Merry Christmas, everyone." No one replied. I put on my coat and opened the door. Cold wind rushed in, the snow falling harder now, slicing across my face like shards of glass. Behind me, my father's voice roared, "Don't come back if you don't know how to be grateful." I didn't look back. The door slammed shut, echoing through the silent winter night. On that snow-covered street, I walked without knowing where I was headed, only that it was the last time I would ever stand inside that house. The place I once called home had never been one. It was just where I learned to serve and stay silent. I walked down the white, frozen street, unable to even feel the cold cutting through my coat. My hands trembled. I couldn't tell if it was from the wind or the shock. Light spilled from the windows of nearby houses, families gathered around their tables, laughter ringing out, the smell of gingerbread drifting through the air. I looked through those glowing windows and felt as if I was standing outside another world, one where people knew how to love, how to apologize, and how to stay silent when someone was hurting. As for me, I had only the snow, the night, and my own breath turning into mist in the freezing air. I stopped at the corner of the street and pulled out my phone. My fingers were so numb that I dialed the wrong number twice before finally calling Aunt Maggie. She was my mother's older sister, the one who had taken care of me during the summer when I was 13, back when my parents fought every single day. I still remembered the smell of cinnamon in her small kitchen, and the way she spoke slowly, gently, as if nothing in the world could ever shake her calm. The phone rang 3 times before I heard her voice, raspy but warm. "Olivia? Why are you calling so late?" The moment I heard her, tears welled up in my eyes. I didn't sob, my voice just trembled as I said, "I have nowhere else to go." She was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, "Stay right where you are." "Tell me where." I gave her the address quickly. She didn't ask anything more, just said, 15 minutes. "Don't move." I stood huddled beneath a streetlight, my toes nearly numb. Every minute felt like an hour. Then I saw the headlights of a Subaru pulling up beside me. The window rolled down, and her voice came through the cold air, "Get in, sweetheart." She didn't ask a single question on the way. The only sounds were the wipers brushing snow off the windshield and the faint hum of Silent Night playing on the radio. I stared out the window, watching the glow of small houses reflected on the slow-falling snow. Inside me was a hollow space of ice, the place where family was supposed to live. About 30 minutes later, the car turned down a quiet lane, leading to a wooden cabin on the edge of Lake Oswego. Warm yellow light glowed from inside, a small Christmas tree decorated simply with silver ribbons and a few greeting cards. Maggie took off my coat, gently pulled me toward the kitchen, and said only one thing, "Sit down. You need something warm." She made cocoa, added a bit of cinnamon and fresh milk, and the sweet aroma filled the little kitchen. I held the mug with both hands, the heat from the porcelain seeping into my palms, and for the first time that night, I felt the blood slowly returning to my body. Aunt Maggie sat across from me, studying my face for a long moment before asking softly, "What did Robert say this time?" I shook my head, not wanting to relive it. She sighed. "And Linda stayed silent, didn't she?" I looked down at my cocoa, watching the swirl of cream on the surface. "Mom, she's still the same." Maggie nodded slowly, her voice calm but heavy with sorrow. "No one deserves your endless patience, Olivia. When you keep enduring, they start believing you're giving them permission to walk all over you." I didn't reply. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. Then she brought me an old wool blanket that smelled faintly of soap and damp wood. I lay down on the sofa in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly beside me. Every sound outside, the wind brushing the windows, the tree branches tapping the roof, felt strangely peaceful. I took a small notebook from my bag, its first page already wrinkled from tears. My hand trembled as I wrote, but the words came out firm. "Today, I officially resign from being the good daughter." I set down the pen and closed my eyes. In the dark, I heard the quiet creak of the door as Maggie peeked in, gently pulling the blanket higher over my shoulder. I didn't speak, just whispered silently in my mind. "This Christmas, I lost my family, but maybe I've finally found myself." Morning light filtered through the curtains of the cabin, a soft gold tinged with the cold hue of an Oregon winter. I opened my eyes to the faint clinking sounds of Maggie in the kitchen. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, warm and comforting, almost enough to make me forget the night before, almost. Then my phone buzzed on the table, its screen lighting up. My heart tightened, a message from Emily. Her tone was as blunt and detached as ever, as if nothing had happened. "Why can't I withdraw $3,000 from your account?" I stared at that message for a long time, my mind completely blank. No concern, no apology, just, why can't I withdraw the money? I remembered that account. I'd opened it 2 years ago when Emily said she was struggling to pay her rent. I agreed to make it a joint account, telling her it was for emergencies only. I naively believed that if I helped her, she would understand that sisterhood meant more than money. But maybe I'd only been lying to myself. I opened the banking app. The transactions scrolled down one after another, each line cutting deeper into what little trust I had left. $450, Nordstrom. $200, Spa Retreat. $180, Ticketmaster. $89, Sephora. All from the past month. I just sat there, frozen. Emergency expenses, huh? The only emergency here was her addiction to spending. I thought back to all the times she'd faked tears, saying, "I just need a small loan. My boyfriend dumped me. I'm so stressed." I had sent money without hesitation. Looking back now, it was almost laughable how stupidly hopeful I had been. I pressed close joint account. My finger trembled slightly, but there was no hesitation. The confirmation message appeared. "Funds will be transferred to your primary account." I hit OK. A soft ding followed. Done. It felt like cutting a rope that had been choking me for years. I sank into the chair, breathing deeply. Aunt Maggie walked out, holding a cup of coffee, watching me with concern. "Something wrong, sweetheart?" I shook my head and said quietly, "Nothing serious. I just cleared out a nest of parasites." Maggie didn't ask further. She just nodded, placed her hand on my shoulder, and said, "Good. The sooner you cut them off, the less it hurts." Not even 10 minutes later, the phone rang. Emily. I wasn't planning to answer, but then I realized I had nothing left to fear. I pressed accept. Her voice came through sharp as a blade. "Are you insane? Mom says you're selfish. You embarrassed me in front of my boyfriend. Do you even realize that?" I let her rant, her voice rising higher, breaths coming fast and furious. Then I spoke, calm and steady, each word deliberate. "No one has the right to spend my money anymore. Not even family." There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. "You're pathetic. You might have money, but nobody loves you." I didn't respond. I simply hung up. No goodbye. No tears. I set the phone down, still holding my warm coffee cup, feeling as if I'd just burned a bridge, but it was a bridge that only led into the swamp. The cabin window was slightly open, snowflakes drifted through the air, the pale light glinting across the old wooden floor. I looked out toward the snow-covered pines, and in that quiet moment, I realized something I didn't need them to survive. All those years, I'd lived out of pity for others and forgotten how to have compassion for myself. That night, I wrote in my notebook, right beneath the words from the night before, I closed that account and with it, the last door that allowed them to invade my life. This is the first boundary I've ever built. And this time, it will not be broken. I think you time Saul's to 8. The next afternoon, just as I was about to make a second cup of coffee and organize the design drafts on my laptop, my phone began vibrating nonstop. I opened it. Notifications from the family group chat I had ignored since last night. The first line hit me like a punch to the chest. "Cleaning day." Below it was a photo Emily had posted, my old room back home, the only peaceful corner in that fractured house now completely destroyed. The wardrobe overturned, the mirror shattered, the bedsheets torn apart, papers scattered across the floor. Beneath it, my father had left a thumbs-up reaction. My mother, as always, stayed silent. I couldn't believe my eyes. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen, my heart weighed down as if something heavy were pressing on my chest. My hands trembled around the phone, and I could almost feel every fragile thread of connection inside me snapping, one by one. No apology. No explanation. Just a cruel, public joke that my entire family seemed to treat as entertainment. I sent Emily a message. "What did you do?" No reply. 5 minutes later, I called. The phone rang 3 times before it was cut off. She had blocked my number. I texted Mark, Aunt Maggie's son, my cousin, the one person in the family I truly trusted. "Mark, can you check on my parents' house for me? My room's been destroyed." He replied shortly. "Stay where you are. I'll go." I'll go. Half an hour later, he called back. His voice was low, steady, but I could hear the quick, angry breath behind it. "Olivia, it's worse than the photo. Your laptop's broken in half. Documents, files looks like they were deliberately torn apart. Even the safe where you kept your certificates, it's been forced open." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. "Who did it?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew. Mark hesitated for a few seconds, then said quietly, "Uncle Robert said, it's a lesson for the ungrateful." "No, Vistan." I said nothing. No anger, no shouting, no dramatic outburst like in the movies. I just sat there, staring out the cabin window as the snow thickened outside. Everything around me felt too still, too quiet, so quiet it hurt, and in my head, Maggie's voice echoed from the night before, "No one deserves your endless patience." She was right. Maybe this was it, the final line. The line between being human and being cruel. Mark sent a few more photos. I stared at them, recognizing everything I had worked so hard to earn: the laptop I'd used for 5 years, the framed picture of my mother and me from my college graduation, the engineering degree I had once proudly hung on my wall, all shattered, buried under dust and broken glass. Each image felt like a knife driven deep into memory. I didn't know what they were trying to prove. That I was truly worthless? Or that they could destroy everything I owned without facing a single consequence? The strange thing was, in that moment, I didn't feel pain anymore. Only emptiness. A cold, hollow kind of void, but it was also the first space of freedom I'd had after years of being bound by guilt and expectations. Maybe when a person is pushed to the very edge of pain, tears stop falling. All that remains is absolute silence. I looked at the screen and typed back to Mark. "Don't touch anything. Thank you, go home." He replied with a single message, "Don't ever go back there." I set the phone down and sat still in front of the fireplace. The flames flickered steadily, the orange light dancing across the wooden cabin walls. I wondered if my father had ever truly seen me as his daughter. Or had I always just been a worker in his house, a convenient name to blame when things went wrong? I took a deep breath and nodded to myself. The last piece of faith had crumbled. And with it, every tie that once bound me to that house was gone. That night, I stepped out onto the porch. The wind swept through the pines, carrying the crisp scent of fresh snow, cold, but clean. I tilted my head toward the gray sky and whispered to myself, if this was their way of teaching me a lesson, they forgot one thing: I've always been the fastest learner. 2 days later, when the snow had finally stopped and the sun began peeking through the pine forest draped in white, I heard a knock at the cabin door. Aunt Maggie was making tea. She looked up, and I went to open it. It was Mark standing there in a thick coat, his cheeks flushed red from the cold. In his hand was a pale yellow envelope, its corner bent and creased, as if someone had gripped it too tightly. "Uncle Robert asked me to bring this to you," he said quietly, his voice hesitant. I looked at the envelope but said nothing. The moment I saw my father's handwriting on the front, slanted, dry and cold, just like his voice, my chest tightened. I took it, thanked Mark, and invited him inside. Maggie poured an extra cup of tea, but Mark shook his head. "I won't stay long," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you got it." He paused, then added, "You should read it with Aunt Maggie." I sat down on the wooden chair by the fireplace, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the envelope. The faint smell of old paper and cigarette smoke rose up, stinging my throat. The first line was exactly what I expected: a reprimand. "Olivia, You've brought shame to this family. The whole neighborhood is talking about you leaving home. You've hurt your mother, humiliated us all. If you think you're better than everyone else, let's see how long that pride keeps you warm." I kept reading, each word scraping across my heart. But then, halfway through the letter, I stopped cold. There was a line that made my stomach drop. "And don't pretend you were never helped. Back when the family was struggling, I had to take out a $5,000 loan under your name. Without that money, you wouldn't have even gone to college, so don't act like you did it all on your own." This starting. I froze, my eyes locked on the number. A $5,000 loan under my name? I had never taken out any loan. I looked over at Aunt Maggie. She had already set her teacup down, her expression hardening. "Let me see that." She read every line carefully, the silence so thick I could hear the wind outside pressing against the door. Then she spoke, her tone low but firm. "Did you ever give him permission to take out a loan in your name?" I shook my head. "Never. I didn't even know about it." Maggie nodded slowly, a flash of anger passing through her eyes. "Then we're going to check." Aunt Maggie grabbed her laptop and opened the Experian credit check site. I entered my information, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The screen spun for a few seconds before a list of active accounts appeared. My breath caught in my throat when I saw not one, but two credit cards. I had never opened, one from Bank of America, the other from Capital One. The total balance was nearly $8,000. One account was still active, the other had been delinquent for 2 months. It felt like the blood in my veins had turned to ice. I kept repeating in my head, 2 cards, not mine, but under my name. Maggie regained her composure faster than I did. She spoke slowly, clearly. "He used your social security number, Olivia. This isn't a family matter anymore. This is a crime." I looked at her, my eyes burning. I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. All I could hear was the faint crackling of the fire, the light flickering across the papers in front of me. My whole life, I had tried not to make my parents ashamed of me. I had tried to be good, responsible, considerate. And this was their way of thanking me? Maggie placed her hand gently on my shoulder, squeezing it. "You need to understand, this isn't just about money. He took advantage of your trust. When people look down on you, they make you feel small. But when they exploit you, it means they think you're too naive to notice. And that's the cruelest part." I didn't respond. I just nodded and picked up the letter again. My father's handwriting trembled near the end, the final lines cutting deep. "If you dare to sue, remember who raised you. Remember whose blood runs in your veins." I folded the letter, the edges crackling beneath my fingers. In that moment, I knew every trace of respect, every hope for reconciliation, was gone. They hadn't just disrespected me, they had used my name like a backup credit card, openly, coldly, and deliberately. I lifted my head and said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else, I wasn't the one who brought shame to this family. They exposed themselves. Aunt Maggie looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. And now it's time you take back what's yours." In the flicker of the firelight, I picked up my teacup again and took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my father anymore. I just felt empty and sharply clear. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I had barely slept. My father's letter still lay on the table, the paper edges crumpled from my grip. Every time I looked at it, I could hear his words echoing in my head. "If you dare to sue, remember who raised you." But that sentence no longer frightened me, it only disgusted me. I knew that if I did nothing, he'd do it again to me, or to someone else. So that morning, I decided to act. Aunt Maggie helped me find a law office in downtown Portland, one that specialized in financial fraud and identity theft. On the drive there, the snow had begun to melt, and the streets shimmered faintly under the pale sunlight. I sat behind the wheel, my mind a storm of emotions, fear, anger, and a cold determination I had never felt before. When I finally met the lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Rachel Myers, she listened to everything from start to finish without interrupting once. After reviewing the photos of the letter, the credit statements, and the printed documents, Rachel set her pen down, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Olivia, this isn't a family issue anymore. This is fraud, a criminal offense that can be prosecuted." I clenched my fists. "I don't want to put my father in jail," I said, my voice hoarse. Rachel nodded, her tone calm and steady. "I understand. But at the very least, you need to protect yourself. We'll have to freeze all your credit files across the 3 national bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. That will stop anyone from opening new accounts under your name." She guided me through filling out the forms, submitting the online requests, and sending the confirmation notices. With every completed step, I felt a small weight lift, as if I were finally building a solid wall after years of letting others trespass freely into my life. When I stepped out of the office, a light rain had begun to fall. I sat in my car, watching the droplets slide down the windshield, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life, even if just a little. I didn't know what the future would look like, but at least now, they couldn't touch me anymore. That night, just as I was about to go to bed, my phone rang. An unknown number, but I recognized my mother's soft breathing the moment I answered. "Olivia, please, don't make this worse," she said. "Your father just made a mistake. You know how he is, he gets angry, but he doesn't mean any harm." I closed my eyes, trying to keep the anger from breaking through. "You're calling to ask me to forgive him?" I asked. "Not forgive," she said, her voice trembling. "Just settle it within the family. Don't let outsiders know. We can't handle that kind of scandal." "I am so it might it." I was silent for a few seconds, then asked directly, "Did you know? Did you know he took out loans under my name?" On the other end, there was only the sound of her heavy breathing. No words. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the cabin's living room, steady, cold, merciless. Finally, I spoke. Slow and clear. "You don't need to choose a side, Mom. I already have." I hung up before she could say another word. The phone slipped from my hand onto the couch, the screen going dark. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of the cabin door. There was a kind of sadness, so deep it went beyond tears, only emptiness remained. I knew, in that moment, the last thread between my mother and me had finally broken. Not because I hated her, but because I had stopped waiting for her to protect me. I stepped out onto the porch, took a long breath of cold air, then went back inside. Before going to bed, I wrote another line in my notebook. "Today, I learned that love cannot save anyone if it always comes with silence." A week after that call, I had stopped expecting anything from my family. Each morning, I made coffee, sat by the cabin window, watching the snow melt slowly from the pine branches, then opened my laptop to check my emails from the law office. Rachel had sent confirmation all 3 national credit bureaus had officially frozen my records. Financially, everything was secure now. But inside, there was still an emptiness that no safeguard could fill. Every night, I still heard my mother's voice echoing in my head, soft, trembling, like someone afraid of the truth she already knew. "Don't make this worse. You know how he is." That morning, Mark showed up at the cabin again. He was holding an old shoebox, its edges frayed, the string around it yellowed and dusty. "Your mom sent this," he said, setting it on the table. "She asked me to bring it, said it's something you left behind." I frowned. I hadn't left anything there. But Mark's eyes didn't stay on me. They flicked briefly toward Aunt Maggie, as if to warn her that something wasn't right. When he left, I sat down, untied the string, and lifted the lid. Inside the box, beneath a few old cards and some faded high school photos, was an old Wells Fargo savings booklet. I recognized it immediately. My name was embossed on the cover. The first line made my throat tighten. The account had been opened when I was 16, with a cosigner, Linda Hart. The notes inside showed deposits made regularly, sometimes a few dozen, sometimes $100 over several years. I remembered how, back in high school, my mother used to say, "When you go to college, I'll have a little fund set aside for you, so don't worry." But I had never seen this booklet before, not once. I turned to the last page. The final withdrawal was dated 2 weeks after my 21st birthday. The amount, $2,982. Withdrawn by Robert Hart. My throat went dry. I sat motionless, hearing only Aunt Maggie whisper behind me, "Oh my God," my mind spun. I was 21 then, in my final year of college, working 40 hours a week at the library to pay my own tuition, surviving on instant noodles for months while my father had taken every dollar my mother had quietly saved for me and I never even knew. At the bottom of the box, I found another envelope unsealed. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably my mother's. I opened it. The first few lines made my breath stop. "Olivia, I found this while cleaning your room. I want you to know everything. Your father withdrew the money. I fought with him about it, but he said, 'She's my daughter, her money is my money.' I was scared, so I stayed quiet. But there's something else you need to know. He didn't just take what was in this account. He borrowed money from relatives too, telling them you were seriously ill, that you needed surgery, and that you were too ashamed to ask for help yourself." I stopped reading and went over the words again, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. The last line of the letter cut straight through me like a blade. "I know you'll be angry, but I wasn't brave enough to stop him. I'm sorry for letting you become his excuse to borrow. Please forgive me for my cowardice. It's not the save." I lowered my head, the letter slipping from my hands. Aunt Maggie stepped closer and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low and warm, but laced with anger. "His child wasn't sick," she said quietly. "He just saw you as an endless wallet to drain." I nodded slowly. Every story, every excuse from my mother, every moment of silence from them, it all pieced together now, forming a picture I could finally see clearly. I wasn't just disrespected. I was exploited. Every dollar I sent, every time I helped, every bit of savings to them, I wasn't family. I was a supply. I held the savings booklet in my hands. The paper felt cold, almost metallic. $3,000, not a fortune, but it stood for something far greater than money. It represented everything they had stolen from me: trust, youth, and the meaning of the word family. I whispered, almost to myself. "Mom said he didn't mean any harm. But what's worse than stealing your own child's trust?" Aunt Maggie didn't reply. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with quiet sorrow. And I knew in that moment, something inside me had broken, but something else was forming too. A boundary. Sharper, clearer, stronger than before, one that no one would ever cross again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cabin was so still I could hear the wind slicing through the pine branches, and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall a reminder that everything was changing, slowly but irreversibly. On the table in front of me sat a small cardboard box containing everything I had gathered: my father's letter, the emptied savings book, the photo of my destroyed room, the bank statements, the hateful text from Emily, and my mother's confession. Every page, every line, was a cut not just into my pride, but into my childhood, into all the years I believed that if I was obedient, hardworking, and patient enough, they would finally love me. Aunt Maggie stepped out from the kitchen, carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot cocoa. The scent of cinnamon blended with the warm aroma of wood. She set 1 cup in front of me, her gaze gentle yet firm. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. I nodded. "I don't have a choice anymore. They've already taken everything, all that's left is my name, and I won't let them stain it again." She didn't say another word, just sat beside me as we gathered every document into a thick folder and labeled it neatly in the corner: fraud and theft, case Olivia Hart. When I closed the cover, she handed me a black marker. "Write down what you need to remember most," she said. I thought for a moment, then wrote across the front in bold, steady letters no longer trembling like before: "You don't own me anymore." I stared at the words, my hands slightly shaking, yet my heart felt astonishingly calm. Maggie smiled faintly. "That's not a declaration of war, Olivia. That's a declaration of freedom." We worked late into the night, organizing every page. Maggie carefully photocopied each document, placing them into two separate folders, one for the lawyer, Rachel, and one to keep as backup. When everything was done, she placed her hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow, you'll send this file off and then don't look back. You've spent your whole life surviving. Now, live to be free." I nodded, unable to find the right words. Inside me, a quiet storm of emotions swirled: grief, anger, regret, but above them all was something new: clarity. The next morning, dawn had barely broken. Portland still seemed half asleep under a thin veil of fog. I put on a heavy coat, grabbed the folder, and drove out of the forest road where Maggie's cabin sat. The streets were empty, lined with pine trees cloaked in mist, faint golden lights glowing in the distance. I stopped in front of the downtown post office, took a deep breath, and placed the thick envelope on the express mail counter addressed to Rachel Myers, attorney at law. When the clerk stamped and sealed it, a weight lifted off my chest. For the first time in years, I felt light, as if I had finally let go of a stone I'd been carrying all my life. On my way back, I turned down the street that led to my parents' house, the road I had walked countless times before, always hoping to be welcomed. Now, there was only silence. The beige house still stood there, calm and unchanged, except for the porch once glowing with Christmas lights, now bare and cold. I stepped out of the car, the second copy of the file in my hand. I didn't knock, I didn't ring the doorbell. I simply opened the mailbox by the gate, placed the envelope inside, and closed the lid gently. No note. No message. No explanation. They didn't need to hear from me anymore. Everything they needed to understand was already in that envelope. As I turned to leave, the wind picked up, swirling a few dry leaves around my feet. I looked back one last time and saw the Hart family sign on the gate, its paint faded and metal rusted. It was ironic. That name had once made me proud, and now it felt foreign, like a relic from someone else's life, no longer mine. I got back into the car, started the engine, and glanced at the house through the rearview mirror. It grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the gray mist. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. There was only a strange, quiet peace spreading through my chest, the peace of someone who had finally cut the last thread tying them to the past. This wasn't revenge, and I knew it. I didn't want them to suffer. I only wanted to reclaim the right to be myself. And as I drove away from that street, I knew for the first time in my life I was truly free. 2 weeks after I mailed the documents, Portland began to shift into spring. The snow melted quickly, leaving puddles on the streets that reflected sunlight off the glass buildings. But inside me, the change was even more profound: a calmness, a lightness, as if the storm had passed, even though its wreckage still lingered behind. I no longer thought much about my father, my mother, or Emily. I just focused on living, waking up, walking by the lake, cooking, and tidying up the small room in the cabin. Everything seemed peaceful, almost normal. Until the first bits of news began to arrive. One Monday afternoon, Rachel called me. Her voice was steady, slightly raspy, but carried the calm authority of justice. "Olivia, I think you should know. My office received a response from your father's company. They conducted an internal review and discovered his signature on at least 2 unauthorized loan documents. As of today, he's been terminated." I said nothing. Rachel continued, "I know this isn't easy to hear, but this is the legal consequence. They didn't mention you, only that he was caught committing identity fraud within the client system, including one case involving a relative. Your name wasn't disclosed." "I understand," I said quietly. "Thank you." When I hung up, I looked out the window. The sky was painted in shades of orange by the setting sun, and I realized I didn't feel joy or hatred, just emptiness. Some battles don't end with victory, they end with silence. 2 days later, Aunt Maggie received a brief call from Linda. She didn't say much, only that my mother had moved out of the house and rented a small apartment near the old market in Beaverton. When Maggie told me, I simply nodded. "Did she mention me?" I asked. Maggie sighed softly. "No, but she sounded tired, the kind of tired that comes when someone finally steps out of the shadows after too long." "Does it activate?" I knew, in her own way, my mother was running too. Maybe she still didn't have the courage to tell me I was right, but at least for the first time in her life she had found the strength to walk away from his control. And to me, that alone was a beginning. By the end of the week, Mark stopped by the cabin with a local newspaper in hand. He set it down on the table and gave a faint smile. "You might want to see this." On page 3, in a small section about personal finance, the headline read, "Former Miller and Sons employee accused of credit fraud, under investigation." There was no name, but anyone who knew Robert Hart would understand. I read a few lines, then folded the paper shut. "He'll find a way to spin it, just like he always does," I said quietly. Mark only shrugged, offering no comment. But in his eyes, I caught a glimpse of something that felt like justice. The next day, Rachel sent another email. "The accounts under the name Emily Hart have been frozen by the bank. Several transactions have been flagged as suspicious and linked to the fraudulent activity you reported earlier. Any attempt to open new accounts will now trigger an automatic cross-check with the fraud registry." I read the email, my expression calm. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only the thought that, at last, things were beginning to fall back into their rightful order. They were finally facing the consequences of what they once called a joke. From that day on, there were no more messages, no calls, no apologies, no excuses. Silence settled over everything, as if all three of them had vanished from the world. And strangely, I didn't feel lonely. Maybe because I'd lived with silence for so long, but this time, it wasn't frightening anymore. It was the sound of freedom. I started working again. A friend from college helped me get a job at a small engineering firm in downtown Portland. The work wasn't stressful, and my team was kind, ordinary people who knew nothing about my past. I didn't have to hide, didn't have to play the responsible sister or the obedient daughter. I was simply Olivia, an engineer, a woman learning how to breathe again. That evening, I joined the support group Aunt Maggie had once mentioned, adult children of narcissists. In the small room lit by warm yellow lamps, people sat in a circle, sharing their stories. I listened more than I spoke, but every word they said felt like fragments of my own life. People who had grown up in families where love came with conditions, where sacrifice was expected and compassion was currency. When it was my turn, I spoke briefly. I used to think that if I endured enough, they would love me. But maybe the only thing they ever taught me was how to love myself. The room fell silent for a moment, then filled with soft nods and quiet breaths, the kind that said, "We understand." When I returned to the cabin that night, I brewed a cup of peppermint tea and sat by the window, slightly ajar. The night breeze brushed against my hair, carrying the faint scent of laurel blossoms. I smiled, not out of bitterness, not out of irony, but from a kind of lightness I hadn't known before. I realized I no longer needed to wait for anyone to change. I had already stepped away, and that alone was enough to begin a new life. One afternoon in March, Portland was finally warming after weeks of rain. I had just finished work and was sitting in my car at a red light when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I thought I'd never see again: Emily. The message was short: "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange mix of surprise and emptiness. No anger, no hatred, just the detached stillness of recognizing a shadow from a past life. I almost deleted it, but for some reason, I typed back, "Where?" The reply came almost instantly: Café Alder, 4 p.m. I arrived right on time. The cafe sat quietly on the corner, sunlight streaming through the glass windows, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. I chose a table by the window, ordered a latte, and waited. 5 minutes later, Emily walked in, still with that quick stride, a designer bag slung over her shoulder, but the confidence I remembered was gone from her face. She looked around, spotted me, and slowly made her way over. When she sat down, her eyes darted away, her hands twisting together nervously. You look better than I expected," she said, her voice hoarse, forcing a smile. I just shrugged. "You look tired." She nodded faintly. "I don't even know where to start," Emily murmured, staring down at her glass of water. "I guess, you must hate me." I stayed silent. She swallowed hard, then suddenly looked up, her eyes glistening. You ruined the family, Olivia. Since you left, everything's fallen apart. Dad lost his job, Mom moved out, my accounts got frozen. I don't know what to do anymore. I just want things to go back to the way they were. This tenser. Thanks for watching. I looked at her for a long time before speaking, my voice calm, steady, almost detached. No, Emily. I didn't ruin the family. You're just seeing it for what it's always been, the truth I've lived in for years. She frowned, her lips trembling. You talk like it's all my fault. I sighed. No, it wasn't just yours. But you know what hurt the most? It wasn't the betrayal, it was realizing that you knew I was in pain and you still laughed. Emily broke down. Tears spilled onto the table, soaking into the crumpled napkin in her hand. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I was stupid, selfish. I thought it was just a joke. I never thought you'd leave. I didn't think it would end like this. I looked at her and, for the first time, there was no anger left in me. Only the quiet fatigue of someone who had walked too far to turn back. Emily, I said softly, I used to want to hear that apology. But not anymore. Forgiving you doesn't mean returning. And I can't rebuild what you chose to break. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Then what do you want me to do? I smiled, not bitterly, but gently, truly. If you really want to make things right, start by living without leaning on anyone. Don't borrow money, don't use someone's love as an excuse. Stand on your own feet, that's the only apology that means something. We sat there for a few more minutes in silence. Emily wiped her tears, trying to smile, but it broke halfway. I stood, placed enough cash on the table to cover both coffees. She whispered, You're not coming back, are you? I paused, my back to the door, and said softly, No. But I hope you find your own path someday. I stepped out of the cafe, the glass door closing behind me with a faint chime that rang through the warm afternoon air. Outside, the sun poured over the damp sidewalk, the scent of coffee drifting through the breeze, and I felt a quiet weight lift from my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't need to anymore, because finally I had left truly, completely, and free. I moved into a new apartment at the start of summer, a small, peaceful place by the Willamette River, just 10 minutes from downtown Portland. It had one bedroom and a tiny balcony, but every morning sunlight filled it completely. I painted the walls a soft cream, hung a few landscape photos I'd taken on trips with Aunt Maggie, and placed a pothos plant by the window. At first the silence frightened me, but soon I realized it was exactly what I needed. No more arguments, no more favors, no more messages demanding money. Only the sound of wind and the gentle rhythm of water against the shore. On my first day in the new apartment, I opened the notebook I had brought from Aunt Maggie's cabin and wrote the first line on a fresh page. Today, I am no longer the servant. I paused, staring at the words for a long time. It wasn't a declaration of pride, it was a quiet acknowledgement. For so long, I had served everyone except myself. But now, things were different. I cooked my own meals, planted lavender on the balcony, and every evening, as the sun dipped behind Portland's old iron bridges, I picked up a paintbrush and began to paint. At first, the strokes were clumsy and aimless. But slowly, shapes began to form, light and color came alive, and in every painting, I could see pieces of myself learning to view the world through my own eyes. Work at the new company soon settled into a steady rhythm. I was still diligent and punctual, but I no longer tried to please everyone. I learned how to say no, how to rest when I was tired, and how to cherish the people who genuinely cared for me. Every weekend, I visited Aunt Maggie, sometimes helping her cook, sometimes watering the garden, sometimes just sitting with her on the porch, sipping tea in silence. She always asked, "Do you ever regret it?" And every time, my answer was the same. No. I only regret not leaving sooner. She would just smile, that same warm, gentle smile that once filled her cabin with light. Time passed faster than I expected. When winter returned and snow covered the rooftops along the river, I realized a full year had gone by. On Christmas Eve, I didn't throw a party or invite anyone over. I made a cup of hot cocoa, played soft music, and stood by the window, watching the snow fall. The lights from the apartments across the river shimmered on the water like a silver ribbon. I thought back to the previous Christmas, the noisy room, the fake laughter, my father's shouting, the moment I was cast out into the cold. Just 1 year and I had come so far. Aunt Maggie came to visit, carrying a warm apple pie she'd baked that morning. We sat by the window, eating and watching the snow drift softly outside. She looked at me and smiled. "You know, Olivia," she said gently, "peace isn't something people give you, it's something you choose. And you chose it, something they'll never understand." I set my cup of cocoa down and gazed out the window, where the falling snow had turned the whole sky white. Her words echoed in my mind like the perfect closing line to a long, hard chapter. I walked back to my desk, opened my journal, and wrote one final sentence. This year, I'm not setting the table for anyone. I'm setting the table for my own life. Then I smiled, a quiet, peaceful smile that needed no audience. To anyone out there who's ever felt invisible in your own family, like your voice didn't matter, or your worth depended on how much you gave, please remember this. You are not the role they assigned you. You are not the helper, the quiet one, or the problem. You are a whole person deserving of love, respect, and peace, even if your family never learned how to give it. Healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means walking away and choosing yourself. If this story touched your heart or reminded you that you're not alone, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Every story here is for those who've been silenced too long, and together, we can turn pain into strength and loneliness into connection.